Hello, this is Jamie Mitchell. We are back with another episode of the Libertarian Censored podcast, going over all the posts on Libertarian Censored subreddit. Let's get right into it. So first we have Trump to Bukele. Homegrowns are next. The homegrowns. You gotta build around about 5 more places. It's not big enough. From LegioX, and that's a cross post from the Law subreddit. And yeah, I personally don't care for how Trump's trying to deport people without due process. And, he's joking about now sending the homegrowns over, but, it's just that I think that a lot of Redditors only care since he's a member of the out group rather than the in group. They were fine with any, they constantly make excuses for anything that happened under Biden's presidency, but now that Trump's back in there, suddenly it's the worst thing ever, Trump, I guess I can see it because Trump's kind of more of a spaz than Biden. He does say unhinged stuff like this sometimes, but he never really acts on it. He just likes to get a rise out of people, I think. And yeah, I personally don't really care for his rhetoric, but yeah, Redditors only care because it's the out group doing it rather than the in group. I don't really care for how they took away due process from non-citizens, because I think everyone should be entitled to due process. But with that being said, ultimately the government can justify whatever it feels like, regardless of which branch of the uniparty is in power. And that's my thoughts on that issue. Then we have community outrage after Florida teacher loses job for calling student by preferred name, from ComicSans.com, posted by CH4Locks, and that's a cross post from the Republican Values subreddit. And yeah, personally, I don't think people should be fired for just calling someone by their preferred name. But, ultimately, those who in positions of authority can fire people for whatever reasons they want to, and sometimes there's nothing you can do about it. I think that's the big problem of having government-run schools in the first place. The government can just fire someone for dissenting at all, like they're doing here. Of course, Reddit is only really mad because the out in group's being fired for dissenting against the official narratives rather than the out group. But you definitely have the out group they've been impacted by stuff like this too. A lot of teachers and other workers were fired because they didn't because of vaccine mandates, and I think that's important to remember as well. Ultimately, I think it's very much the problem with collectivism as a whole, because some people might be in your good graces one day, and in your bad graces the next, and that just goes to show you, you gotta if you want to disassociate with people, that's fine. But I think people are tired of this cancel culture, and that's true whether it be stuff like this or all the left wing examples you see as well. Because someone accidentally misgendered someone once, and that's my thoughts on that issue. Then we have Trump official declares anyone who preaches hate for America will be deported, sparking concerns about the First Amendment, from LatinTimes.com, posted by Help of Eating. And yeah, I personally don't really care for that rhetoric, as I talked about kind of in the first post. But ultimately, the state has the ability to justify doing whatever it wants to, since it has the legal monopoly on the use of force. And it just goes to show you how people. A lot of progressives say they hate monopolies, but they're completely fine with the state having the monopoly on the use of force. And you pretty much have no recourse against them. What are you going to do? Run to the state-controlled police or state-controlled military, or have a trial in the state-controlled courts? It just goes to show you that the state pretty much controls the entire centralized legal system, and it can justify doing whatever it wants with it. And that's why, I think what we need is decentralization. Maybe instead of having one centralized legal system, everyone could have their own legal system, and we'll work it out from there. But right now, I think, we're definitely seeing the pitfalls of having one centralized legal system, and that's my thoughts there. Then we have government roads, posted by Hopeful Decision 971, and that's a meme. But without government, who will build the roads? And it's government roads, and it's a picture of a road that looks pretty much like completely ruined of potholes. And they added, yeah, if it weren't for government, we wouldn't have to fix our cars every 6 months. And yeah, I would agree with that. I don't think the government should be involved with the roads. I think, if people want to make a road, they should be able to. But, right now we have the government is controlling all the transportation infrastructure pretty much in the U.S., especially car transportation. But, they do control other transportation as well, like trains and buses and airplanes. Airplanes got to be. Well, I guess airplanes, they don't have a single government-approved airline, but they don't have government-approved cars either, I guess. But I definitely do think transportation is one of the fields we need to separate the state from the government, from the state from the people, It's just like, we gotta get the state out of education, we gotta get the state out of labor, transportation. It's like pretty much anything that has a cabinet department is something the state needs to be out of. And that's the libertarian position, I would say. You need the state to be on the sidelines rather than actively being involved in daily affairs. And transportation is definitely one of those cases, I would say. And that's my thoughts there. Then we have PETA animal rights groups praise Trump admin for phasing out cruel tests on dogs and other animals from Yahoo.com, posted by Color Monochrome. And yeah, I personally don't really care for PETA, but I think they're kind of a bunch of kind of performative activists, kind of like a lot of people these days. But with that being said, I do think they are correct here. I don't think, we should be performing cruel tests on animals, especially government-funded labs. That's how the coronavirus broke out. And, it's interesting how a lot of animal rights people, who are not PETA, but like a lot of PETA adjacent people who usually would agree with them or will dissent here because, they are agreeing with the Orange Man and agreeing to an action that his administration took, and you can't have that on Reddit pretty much. If you agree with Trump at all, you're in the out group, and yeah, I personally don't agree with Trump, but it's like Trump's a broken clock, I would say. A broken clock is still right twice a day. So just because you don't like Trump doesn't mean you can't agree that he's doing good things. But of course, on Reddit, Reddit only seems to care that they don't seem to have any values other than Orange Man Bad and Tesla Man Bad, which is kind of just an offshoot of Orange Man Bad, I would say. And yeah, it's just pretty much all of Reddit's values at this point are derived from Orange Man Bad, and that's not how you should have your values should work. Your values should derive from more than just one thing. You need to have a diverse array of values if you want it to be principled, if you ask me. And that's my thoughts there. Then we have new state law allows DACA recipients legal residents to become officers from Cobb.com, hosted by Ragnar OKXG, and they added, "What are your thoughts? I think this is a good idea if it helps fill positions, but it has become a controversial topic in my state, and though not said in the story, the legislation creates another pathway to citizenship." And yeah, I think, if the state wants to hire whoever it wants to hire, I think that would be good. I personally don't really care for the state, anyone with a position of government authority. But, ultimately the state will justify whatever it wants to justify. If it wants to hire DACA, it should be able to, I think. If it wants to hire illegal immigrants, that should be able to, it should be able to, I think. But, just because you might like someone who's been hired by the state doesn't mean, the state's inherently good. It's interesting how a lot of Redditors seem to be for this, even though they usually hate the police. But since DACA, since they support stuff like DACA, they would be for their ability to become officers, even if they would say, all cops are bastards, fuck the police in the same sentence. And that just goes to show you how, since the police are out group, they're going to be against them, but suddenly there is a member of if they're in the in group, they want them to do whatever they want, even if it means joining the out group. And that's my thoughts on that issue. Then we have good news about qualified immunity from Spare Simeon, and they added, a judge admits in no uncertain terms that qualified immunity is a contrived creation of the judiciary. He blocks it in this case, but states that he's a middleman and can't affect the larger situation. That's up to Congress and the Supreme Court. And I'd agree with that. I don't really care for qualified immunity. I think that's just one of the offshoots of the police having the monopoly on legal use of force. I think if people want to go after police officers going after them, they should be able to. But right now, the police pretty much have legal immunity from doing whatever. They could probably just shoot you in the middle, just take all your stuff or shoot you, and they usually have a way out of it. I think Derek Chauvin's one of the only ones I can think of who did a bad thing and actually went to jail for it. And yeah, that just goes to show you, I do like the direction it's heading, but I think qualified immunity is just only part of the larger picture, and that the state will always necessarily look after its own. And the state and is the one who's controls the police. So yeah, ultimately I think the libertarian solution would be get rid of state-run police departments and maybe replace them with private militia to enforce the law instead. And that's my thoughts on that issue. Then we have, it now identifies as a GMC, genetically modified Cybertruck. Not my joke, from Ragnarok HD, and that's cross-post from the funny subreddit, and that looks like it's a Cybertruck painted red, and someone put GMC on the back of it, I guess, because, the woke progressives have been burning down all the Teslas. I don't think that's really fooling anyone, but, I think people should be able to do whatever they want with anything they own. It's why I'm very much against stuff like intellectual property and all that, because, I think if you own something, you should be able to do whatever you want with it, and that's my thoughts there. Then we have Trump to Fox on deporting Americans to a gulag in El Salvador. We want to do it. I would love to do that. From post by Dr. that's a cross post from the LOL subreddit. And yeah, I personally don't really care for that, as I mentioned earlier. I think that kind of goes against due process. But ultimately, the state can justify doing whatever it wants to. It can enshrine due process in law, but that doesn't mean the state will actually follow it. It doesn't really matter what the law actually is. It matters who's enforcing the law. And it doesn't really matter laws are just words written down on a piece of paper. What matters is how they're enforced by the state. And that's why, people, as I said I think in the last episodes, people always like to focus on who's making the laws, but I think who's enforcing the laws is arguably much more important. Then we have another tariff-related ballot for farmers seems to be under consideration from LegioX, and that's a tweet from More Perfect Union. Trump's press secretary Levitt just confirmed that the president is confirming a tariff ballot for farmers. And yeah, I personally don't really care for tariffs or government bailouts, but ultimately, as I've said, the state is going to justify what it justifies, and sometimes there's nothing you can do about it. Then we have our classical libertarians disappearing from Loud Silence 93. And they said, it seems like anything that is branded as libertarian nowadays is just paleo-libertarianism or some sort of conservatism. And, yeah, I guess you can make that argument. Personally, I think a lot of libertarians, both on the left and the right, are too caught up in all this left-right paradigm. I would say the libertarian position isn't left versus right, or liberal versus or conservative, or progressive versus conservative. It's individual versus collective. And, libertarians should be for the individual, of course, as long as, that they're not forced to do anything they don't want to and they're not hurting anyone else. So, I do think, classical libertarians are kind of disappearing in our highly partisan society these days. But, I think people need to remember that it's not, left versus right. It's the state versus you, individualism versus collectivism, and I think that's the messaging libertarians should be using. Then we have Trump grants pollution subsidies to nearly 70 coal plants. Your children will carry the cost of cleaning up their pollution, will suffer medically to grant them higher profit, from APnews.com, posted by CH4Locks, and that's the actual headline is Trump exempts nearly 70 coal plants from binary rule, mercury, and other toxic air pollution. And yeah, I personally don't think, the coal plants should be polluting, but ultimately, I don't think the state should be enforcing anything. So I think if the coal plants do want to pollute and put mercury and toxins in the air, I think they should be able to. But if people don't like that, I think they have the force to stop it. I think they should be able to as well. So ultimately, I think it should come down to what force the people have and what force the coal plants have, and whoever wins that should be able to do whatever they want. And yeah, I personally don't really care for pollution, but sometimes pollution is a necessary thing when it comes to stuff like manufacturing coal. And I don't really want to use coal, but I think people should be able to use whatever energy source they feel like, and that's my thoughts there. Justify doing whatever you feel like as long as you're not hurting anyone else. But I guess the counter argument would be, oh, pollution is hurting other people. Well, I guess you can also argue that words can potentially hurt other people, but that doesn't mean a word we should have illegal words. So ultimately, I think people, if they want to feel like pollution is hurting them, want to use justify using force against these coal plants, they should be able to. But ultimately, people will justify regardless of the legal systems in place. Then we have Homeland Security funding for CVE programs expires from the Register.com, posted by Ninja Lover. And yeah, I personally don't really care for Homeland Security at all. But of course, the people in the comments seem to like it because Russia and North Korea would be for it. But because this subreddit is pretty much all just DNC shills who will do whatever the DNC says. So yeah, I personally don't think we should have Homeland Security in the first place. And I think if people want to have a CVE program, I don't know what's a CVE, common vulnerabilities and exposures. They should be able to, but I don't know if it should be government run. I'm against pretty much all government run databases like Real ID or anything or even like a sex offender registry, because I think that could be considered the first step to a social credit system. I think if individuals want to have something like a sex offender registry, they should be able to, but having a government run anything is going to be prone to government abuse, and that's my thoughts on that issue. Then we have Trump confirms he reduced tariffs to help Tim Cook. While denying he ever changes his mind, Trump has now said he had helped out Apple with tariffs because of the conversations with Tim Cook. And that's from AppleInsider.com from Donald Key, and that's cross-post from the technology subreddit. And yeah, I personally don't really think that the government should be exempting certain companies from its laws, but ultimately the government has the monopoly on legal use of force to justify doing whatever it wants to. Then we have reminder, if you accept that non-citizens have no right to due process, you are accepting that citizens have no right to due process. All the government has to do is claim that you are not a citizen. Without due process, you have no chance to prove the contrary. And I would agree with that. I think the problem is that, and I was by Ragnarok KT, by the way, and I think the problem here is that that people like them think our rights come from the state. They don't come from the state. They're innate. Our rights are in contrary to the state, not because of it. Ultimately, the state can take away whatever rights it feels like from you, since it has a legal monopoly on the use of force, and you have pretty much no recourse since they control the legal system. But so yeah, I personally think it's not very good, but that's just how it is currently, and sometimes you just have to cope with it. I personally try and stay out of the state's way a lot of the time. I don't want to cause any trouble and have them come after me. But it comes down to who has the force to justify what, and that's why I don't really care for how they are reporting people about due process, but ultimately they have the force to do so. Then we have UK Supreme Court says trans women are not legally women under Equality Act from nytimes.com, posted by Dr. 07. And yeah, I personally don't think, I personally would agree that transgender women are not biological females. But with that being said, I don't think the state should be determining what the definition of words, like when it comes to like marriage or woman. I think each individual should have their own definitions. That's why I'm very much against government definitions. And like as I mentioned earlier, government databases are pretty much the same thing. They might seem well intentioned, but the state shouldn't be determining what defines what. That's what the people should be doing. Define words however you feel like. I don't want to tell you what you can and can't think of what each word means. And that's my thoughts there. And I think we're gonna wrap it up there. I'll see you guys in the next episode. Bye.